We'll go ahead and get started this morning. First thing on the agenda is request for bill introductions. Senator Sykes, welcome to the Tax Committee. Minority Leader, I almost said Majority Leader.
Okay, if only it were so. Thank you, Madam Chair. I have 3 bills I would like to introduce as committee bills, and I have RS numbers. The first is 0402, and it's a bill concerning food sales tax.
So the way we do it in this committee is a couple of things, and I would ask the next time, Madam Minority Leader, would you please read the rules for the committee? We do not, I only knew of the one introduction. So committee, do you have any questions or objections to the request for the food sales tax bill introduction? Senator Baumgardner.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you for being here. So what is the peanut of the bill?
The peanut of the bill, it was going to that 0%, as April is what is the governor's bill. And then it also includes feminine hygiene products and diapers.
Madam Chair.
Senator Baumgardner.
Is April a hard date? Because, you know, when we passed our legislation, we've had difficulty with stores just being able to implement from the passage in legislature to the July or to the January date. So
Senator Sykes.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you for the question. Talking to the revenue, they think the sooner that we could pass this is something that can be done, and they've worked with different retailers that did have problems. They think this is doable, but again, it's up to the legislature.
So, Senator Baumgardner. Okay, is there any objection to the request for the bill introduction? Seeing none, we'll make the request, Senator. And so did you want to come back Tuesday, or do you want to attempt to?
And could I attempt to do the other, because my next one is the one
I may
we
have
discussed.
objection on them, but go ahead.
Okay, thank you.
Because it is against the rules, so I feel like I got to run a pretty tight ship.
No, I'm sorry from our conversation yesterday. I felt like you wanted to get these in.
I knew of the one.
Okay.
I only knew of the food sales tax. I didn't know the others.
Oh, I thought we discussed that. Sorry, Madam Chair. The next one is RS number 0403, and this is the school sales tax holiday that I believe we discussed.
That was the only one I knew of. I did not know about the food one. I stand corrected, yes. So any questions or objections on the school sales tax holiday? Seeing none, we'll make the request.
Thank you. I can wait till Tuesday for the other if you prefer.
That would be much appreciated. We are queuing up the other 2 bills that had been introduced on the school sales tax holiday. I thought let's move forward from that. And Tuesday, you can make the request. And
Thank you, Madam
yes,
Chair.
if we can get you in the queue for Thursday, we will. We do have the other 2 bills queued up for hearings on Thursday, so I'd like to deal with them all at the same day. Thank you.
Madam Chair, and thank you to the committee.
Thank you. Committee, are there any other requests for bill introductions? Seeing none, we'll move forward. Thank you. Committee, I have a couple. Committee, I'll delay that request and make it at the end of committee. Let's go ahead and get started with the first item on the agenda. I would like to welcome Senator Reddy to the Senate Tax Committee. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Thank you, Madam Chair. I am Senator Yusha Reddy, representing Riley County, District 22, a little bit of Clay Center, as well as Geary County. I was on 3 terms on the Manhattan City Commission and in public education teacher as well. So I'm looking forward to working with all of you. Thank you. Welcome,
and thank you. Committee, our first item on the agenda is Eddie Penner. Eddie is going to give us an overview of property taxes. No. He has a good sense of humor. That's funny. Yeah, Yeah, committee, so I'm sure this will, what it usually ends up doing is generates many questions. And so some of them we may be able to field today, but some of them we may have to delay to another time. But it is a good first step. So thank you, Eddie.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The property tax presentation is Tuesday. This morning to start, I'm going to go over the consensus revenue estimates for the group, and then I have some additional receipt and expenditure information, and then the third item that I've got for today is the Special Committee on Taxation's report and recommendations. So to start the consensus revenue estimates, I'm gonna cover four things in this. The first is a little background on how the CRE process works. The second is our most recent economic forecast. The third is our most recent revenue forecast. And then kind of as a concluding matter, just some thoughts on what you might look for in receipts in the coming months. So first, the revenue estimating process. Kansas has used what's termed a consensus process for revenue estimating since at least the 1970s, when the current process was codified into statute. Obviously, there have been some tweaks to that process since that time, but has remained kind of generally the same. What consensus means is that the legislature and the executive branch agree on a forecast for the expectations for receipts for the state. Most states do use this type of process. There are some states that use a process more akin to what is used at the federal level, where the executive branch and the legislative branch, or perhaps the differing chambers or differing parties of a legislative branch, may have their own individual estimates. At the federal level, that usually doesn't pose as many problems as you might anticipate. But at the state level, where we have pretty clear limitations on balanced budget requirements, and certainly no ability to issue our own currency, having different revenue estimates might pose a challenge, as a governor's budget might be based upon one set of numbers and the legislature might be enacting legislation based upon a totally separate set of numbers. And so the idea of having a uniform set for everybody to use, both chambers, both parties, both branches, is of some value to a state government. And the statute requires that estimates be made by December 4th and April 20th of each year. And then the April 20th estimate is updated again for legislation passed after that date, but during the legislative session. And so we issue what we term the adjustments memo, usually in early June. We typically issue it shortly after sine die. The estimating group by statute is an agreement between the Director of Legislative Research and the Governor's Director of the Budget. Of course, as a practical matter, it's a bit bigger process than that. We involve, of course, the staffs of KLRD and the Division of the Budget, numerous staff members from the Department of Revenue, some other state agencies for more narrowly tailored estimates, and then also consulting economists from the state research universities. And then while we do have a kind of single main meeting where we reach the final agreement on the numbers, there are a number of kind of feeder meetings that lead up to that and help us get to those final numbers. The other thing I would mention is that while we do make actually just single estimates for the full year, for reporting purposes, we then do kind of parse those estimates out into 12 individual monthly estimates and provide monthly updates for kind of where we are. However, I do want to clarify that those are really designed to be kind of just status updates and are not kind of truly estimates the way that the full year estimates are. And there are certainly some limitations to those, one of which I'll touch on later in my presentation. So first, the economic forecast that we have. If you should have in front of you a memo from our office that's actually a joint memo from our office and the Division of the Budget to the Legislative Coordinating Council and the Governor, dated November 21st, 2022. This is what is colloquially referred to as the long memo. If you turn to page 4 of that memo, at the top of the page, you will see the consensus economic forecast for the forecast period. I want to draw your attention to just a few highlights in that. And the first of those is that you can see that our real growth rate that we have projected is 1.1% for calendar 23 and 1.6% for calendar 24. Underlying that, though, is a nominal growth rate of 6.1% and an inflation growth rate of 5% for calendar 23, and a nominal growth rate of 5.6% and an inflationary growth rate of 4.0% for calendar 24. When you hear economic releases, broadly speaking, the real growth rate is, of course, what most people are generally concerned with when you think about the rate the economy is growing. However, for tax receipts, the nominal growth rate tends to be kind of what drives the bus. And so, when the state receives 5% more in taxes, for our purposes as revenue estimators, it doesn't matter to us if that is 4% inflation and 1% real growth, or 1% inflation and 4% real growth. Of course, for people out there in the world, in the real world, so to speak, that distinction is very important. But for tax receipt purposes, it really doesn't matter. What that does mean, though, is that there are kind of two potential risks at a high level to our revenue forecast. One of those is the growth of the real economy, and the other is the inflation that exists throughout the economy. So two things that might jeopardize the accuracy of these forecasts, either to the upside or the downside, would be either the real growth rate being lower than what we're forecasting, or the inflationary growth rate being lower than what we're forecasting. And so if we get into the calendar year and you're seeing that it seems as though inflation is well below 5%, that might strike you as a good thing for people if inflation starts to come in. But in terms of receipts, it might actually expose that there's a risk to the downside for what the state might receive. And so that's kind of what I wanted to highlight in terms of the economic forecast. And from there, I will turn to the revenue forecast for the state. If you turn to page 9 of that memo, you have table 1. That table compares the fiscal year 22 actual receipts to the November estimates for fiscal years 23 and 24. If you flip that over to page 10, table 2 compares the previous estimates for fiscal 23 to the November revisions for fiscal 23. November was the first official estimate for fiscal 24, so there is no comparison table for that year. When we revise the estimates in April, there will be a table 3 that is the newly revised estimate for fiscal 24 compared to the previous estimate for fiscal 24. So I'm actually going to first summarize table 2 and then pivot back to table 1 and speak mainly on that table. Table 2, the maybe most important thing to note is that the very bottom line number, you can see that we added $794.2 million to the fiscal year 23 in November. 773 million of that was from total taxes, if you jump up just a few lines, and then 21.2 million of that was from the non-tax receipts that the state receives into its general fund. We added about $440 million to individual income tax, about $123 million to corporate income tax, almost $190 million to sales tax, and $6.3 million to use tax. Those items made up kind of the bulk of the changes throughout the estimates. From there, I'm going to pivot backwards to table 1 and highlight a handful of items. If you look at the very bottom line number, you can see that the fiscal 23 estimate for total receipts is $9.7 billion, which represents a 22.6% increase over the fiscal year 22 actuals. However, that is a little bit misleading because a lot of that change falls in the non-tax receipts section. So if you jump up just a few lines, you can see that the total tax receipts estimate is $10.06 billion, which represents a 3.1% increase over the fiscal 22 actual amount of $9.76 billion. If you look down below the total for non-tax revenues and receipts, it is kind of a one-time, very large transfers out of the state general fund in fiscal year 2022. Those transfers were made up primarily of the $1 billion that you transferred to the Budget Stabilization Fund, as well as the transfers to the KPERS Trust Fund that were made in that year. There was kind of one more further extraordinary transfer out to the KPERS Trust Fund that was made in 2023. And so if you look at the other revenues and receipts total for 2024, that is kind of what is the normal number. And by 2024, we get back to normal in those other revenues and receipts section. And so you can see that in 2024, the total tax estimate is $10.15 billion, which represents a 0.9% increase over the revised 2023 estimate. The thing I want to highlight there is that that does include the fiscal impacts of the continued reduction to the food sales tax rate, and also some of the for the impacts of the corporate rate reduction attributable to the Apex project, and also the Apex benefits themselves that are on the tax side. That program includes tax and expenditure side benefits, and so this does start to fully capture that Apex program in 2024. And were it not for those policy changes, the tax estimate year-over-year increase would be larger than that 0.9% from 23 to 24. From there, just a few highlights quickly of individual sources. You can see that individual income tax, we're projecting 5.5% growth for 23 over 22, and then 4% growth for 24 over 23. For corporate, we are projecting 4.1% decline year over year, 23 versus 22, and then 16.4% decline in 24. That is where the Apex program starts to really show up, that decline in 24. You see sales tax, we are projecting 1.1% growth in 23, and then flat revenue into 24. That would be positive. It would be a larger positive in 23, and it would be positive in 24 were it not for policy changes implicit in that. 23 includes the kind of first 5 months of receipts attributable to the food sales tax rate reduction, and also the elimination of the estimated tax payment that took place in July. And then 2024 includes a full calendar year of that first rate reduction, and then 5 months worth of receipts of the second scheduled rate reduction. And that is actually the last item that I wanted to highlight on the receipts forecast. I do want to just briefly mention a handful of things that you might look for in the coming months. The first of those is related to the SALT Parity Act. You might remember that was a piece of legislation that you enacted last year as a part of House Bill 2239, or rather Senate substitute for House Bill 2239. That was a piece of legislation that was revenue neutral to the state. It was a credit for taxes paid, but it allowed Kansas taxpayers to avail themselves of greater deductions at the federal level. So it benefited Kansas taxpayers at the federal level, but was net neutral to the state. While it was net neutral to the state in total, it did result in a shift in state receipts across tax sources and in time. And so these represent receipts that typically would have been paid as individual income tax receipts and are now being paid as corporate income tax receipts, and they're receipts that typically would have been paid in either January estimated payments on individual income tax or April-May balance due payments, and are now paid as December and to a very small extent January payments, estimated payments for corporate income taxes. And so if you looked at the December monthly receipts, you saw that we were well ahead of the estimates, a little bit more than $100 million, and more than 100% of that margin existed on corporate tax payments. That is a mirage, and it is going to disappear in the coming months, and it's going to disappear in the form of reduced individual income tax payments, both in the month of January in estimateds, and then also April and May in balance due payments. Right now, that shows us that we are in total $110 million ahead through the month of December. $130 million of that was those SALT Parity Act corporate estimated payments in the month of December. And so it's probably more appropriate to think of us as being $20 million behind the revised estimates through the month of December, not $110 million ahead. That is going to continue to put a lot of noise in the individual and corporate estimate receipts in the coming months. We'll get that trued up as best we can in April, but even then we're going to be operating in the dark a little bit. And the reason for that is that it's kind of at the election of taxpayers whether they take that in terms of reduced estimated payments in January or reduced balance due payments in April and May. And also, according to some other states that enacted similar provisions a year prior, it seems as though some of those taxpayers are taxpayers who file extensions, which means that they don't get it totally and finally trued up until the following October. And so we're going to have some uncertainty around the exact timing of those SALT Parity Act payments all the way through the end of this fiscal year and into the first few months of the following fiscal year. Hopefully by then we'll have a better grasp on the exact magnitude of that program when we make the new estimates next November. Another thing I want to highlight to look for in coming receipts is that February is the month in which food sales tax rate reduction receipts will begin to show up in the receipts. And so we anticipate that January receipts will be kind of an all-time high water mark for sales and use taxes. And then after that, it will likely be many years before the sales and use tax, or rather the sales tax receipts, get up to that January level again, because beginning with the February receipts, you've got a partial reduction in food sales tax, and then that continues to progress as a rate reduction in future years. And so we imagine it'll be several years before we ever see a month as high as January of 2023 in sales tax receipts. And then just the other thing that I want to mention is that generally speaking, February and March are kind of the refund season for individual income taxes. And so individual income taxes tend to come in pretty light in those months. We do try to account for that in the monthly parsing of those estimates. And then April and May are the kind of the balance due season of individual income tax filing season. And so those are when kind of all of the individual income tax money comes crashing in right at the time when we're trying to revise the estimates on April 20th. And so that's just something for you to look at as you look at the monthly receipts. And with that, I would stop and stand for whatever questions the committee might have on any of these topics that I've touched so far.
Thank you very much, Eddie. And I would reiterate what you said. The SALT did not have a fiscal impact on the state. It was much like we changed the sales tax collection. There was no fiscal impact, but it did change the dates as to when that money is received by the state. So thank you. Committee, any questions? Senator Holland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Eddie, good morning. Happy New Year. So I'm glad the Chair clarified that. So once again, the SALT is basically just a shifting of when the revenues are coming in. It's basically a net wash over the time.
Yeah, it's exactly a net wash unless if a taxpayer for whatever reason fails to claim the credit that they are entitled to, it actually could be a slight revenue positive to the state, but it shouldn't be. That would only happen if the taxpayers literally just fill out their forms incorrectly. It's impossible for that to be a negative to the state because it is literally just a credit for taxes paid. They don't get the credit unless they have previously paid the taxes as corporate.
Super. And then a second question, Madam Chair.
Yes, Senator Holland.
Thank you. So Eddie, on Apex, help me out here. We've got the Panasonic project, and you talk about the Apex projections to the revenue. Is that just the Panasonic portion of the deal only? Or is that if both, I call them bites of the apple, if the second bite was taken as well too with the second project, does that bake in both of those or just the Panasonic number?
So these estimates bake in only the Panasonic project and also the 0.5% general corporate rate reduction associated with that project. But it does not factor in any sort of fiscal impact of a second bite at the apple, so to speak. If an agreement is announced, then that would be entirely in addition to these estimates.
Thank you, Eddie. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Senator Reddy.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. So I just have a question I have a lot of questions, so I might have to make a separate meeting with you. But about the compensating use tax, what exactly does that entail? Is that the online taxes that we're collecting, or is it more than that?
It is more than that. Certainly, that is the area that gets the most news as it relates to compensating use, and that's where the bulk of the growth in recent years has been. But compensating use tax applies anytime a purchase is made out of state, for which sales tax would apply if the purchase were made in state, and sales tax is not paid on it elsewhere. And so there's like a credit towards a conceptual credit to the compensating use tax for actual sales tax paid out of state, generally speaking. And so when in addition to kind of what you think of as the online purchases. And another area where this comes into play a lot is actually if a retailer makes a purchase of something that they are using that isn't exempt for ingredient component part type reasons, then they typically would, and it's an out-of-state purchase, then they would typically pay compensating use tax on that as well.
As would individuals, I would assume.
Yes, it's actually a little bit difficult for individuals to do so. We used to have a specific line on the 1040 form to allow those individuals to make those payments, but with the enactment of the marketplace facilitators legislation, the thought was kind of that from individuals, broadly speaking, we should have captured basically all of this at this point, and we deleted that line statutorily from the K40 form. But as you state, that is correct, that individuals do still owe that tax if it isn't paid. It's just a little bit more difficult for them to actually pay it at this point.
Okay, sounds good. Thank you.
Senator Peck.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I don't know why I've got two microphones here. I guess do the political thing. I'll talk out of both sides of my mouth. You mentioned something when you're talking about the consensus revenue estimating group. And I was curious, the university economists, are they strictly consultants? I guess I thought they had sort of a vote, but are they strictly consultants? Because you indicated that by statute, it's sort of an agreement between the legislative branch and the executive branch.
So, as you know, by statute, it is just an agreement between the legislative branch and the executive branch. So I guess in a true sense, they are strictly consultants. And in that same sense, the Department of Revenue's participation in that meeting is strictly consultants when it comes down to actually finalizing the numbers that you see in this table. That is the director of KLRD and the director of budget that agree to it. That being said, when we're in the meeting hammering out those numbers, we all walk into that meeting with our own numbers and including the consultants, and we all walk out with one agreed to number. We've never had an instance where either the Department of Revenue or the consulting economists that we use walk out saying, I disagree with those numbers, I can't live with those, I'm not signing my name onto those sort of situation, even though statutorily they don't sign their name onto them, so to speak, anyway.
Question, Madam Chairman.
Senator Peck.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. The second question I have is, I notice on the Table 2, page 10, that there is a liquor gallonage, liquor enforcement, liquor drink, 3 different taxes. Mm-hmm. My question is, there also a sales tax on liquor or alcohol purchases?
Generally speaking, the liquor enforcement tax is a tax in lieu of sales tax. There are some narrow exceptions where the liquor enforcement tax does not apply, and in that instance, the sales tax does apply, but it's one or the other, and in most instances, it is the liquor enforcement tax.
If I may.
Senator Peck.
Thank you, Madam Chairman. I thought that I just had that question, but you indicated or you said some things that solicit additional question. What instances would there be potentially a sales tax on liquor or alcohol? And maybe alcohol and liquor are one and the same. I do not.
I believe the instance that comes to my mind, and I don't want to say this is the only one, but it's the only one that I can immediately recall, is when beer is sold at grocery stores. Those grocery stores, generally speaking, don't collect the liquor enforcement tax. They collect the general retail sales tax on that. But if that same beer is sold at a liquor store, the liquor enforcement tax would apply and not the sales tax.
Thank you, Madam Chairman.
Well, and Senator Peck, I think Eddie will be touching on this next week on the sales tax. Would that be part of your overview in a little bit more depth?
I can pull that into that. It's a very narrow
it
issue.
would be
It didn't
helpful.
really exist until I think it was 2016 and 17, or either 2016 and 17 or 2017 and 18 legislation that extended sales of beer to grocery stores.
Senator Blasey.
Just kind of piggybacking off that question. So my understanding, I thought it was cereal malt beverage was the sales tax, and then the fuller strength beer was the liquor enforcement. Is that not accurate?
So in the year after the legislation was passed enacting the grocery store authority to sell the fuller strength beer, a trailer piece of legislation was passed that specified that those CMB, cereal malt beverage licensees, when they do sell that stronger beer, that the sales tax applies and not, that we weren't basically creating a whole new set of tax filers for liquor enforcement tax only. Rather, we would have them pay the sales tax.
And so what is the current liquor enforcement tax rate?
I think a senator might know those numbers a little better than I do off the top of
Senator
my head.
Blasey, Senator Holland is very familiar with that. So Senator Holland.
Thank you, Madam Chair. As a owner of a Kansas farm winery, the liquor enforcement tax is actually 8%. So you actually get in the interesting situation of you're actually paying less of a tax for certain types of alcohol when you're buying them directly from the winery or the liquor store versus if you're in other situations, maybe at a bar or something like that.
And it actually depends on what the local sales tax rates are, because of course the state sales tax rate is lower than 8%, but often there is no local liquor enforcement tax. And so if the local sales tax rate is less than 1.5% in total, the tax rate is slightly lower when you're buying it from a grocery store, whereas if it is high, or yeah, and whereas if it is higher than 1.5%, you pay a slightly higher tax rate if you buy it from a grocery store. It's kind of a threading a needle sort of situation there.
Yeah, no, thank you, Eddie. And Senator Red.
Thank you, Madam Chair. So pertaining to the sales tax on alcohol as well as the liquor tax, what goes to the local community? So in the city of Manhattan, we have a special alcohols advisory board. And when we get our sales tax, our alcohol sales tax, it's divided into 3 different departments, and one of them is for the ones that deal with social services that deal with alcohol or any kind of other drugs at risk. So depending on where they buy their liquor or beer or whatever it might be, how does that shift to what a local community might get if it's bought in a, let's say, in a bar, as opposed to a liquor store where they actually go get beer and wine, or a grocery store?
Okay, so if it's bought at a grocery store, they pay the sales tax, and so if there is a local sales tax, then that applies, and it just goes as regular sales tax receipts to the local government. They can't tell any difference between that and buying a bottle of soda. If it is bought at a liquor store or at a bar, the liquor enforcement tax would apply. And this is the SGF portion of the liquor enforcement tax. I did not actually come prepared this morning to discuss
in fact,
the distribution of these taxes to other funds, but there are some other funds that go to that. And then if it's bought at a bar, the liquor drink tax also applies.
Yeah, and Eddie, I'm going to bring us back on topic for today's discussion. I appreciate the questions. We will address those during the sales tax. But this is about the estimates and the finances coming in. We want to make sure that we make good tax policy decisions. So I feel like we've got to have the balancing act of where we're at in revenues versus what we anticipate trying to buy down on taxes. I would like to bring you back to the SALT comment, and I just want to state this simply, that when we passed that SALT legislation, we did not impact state revenues, but what we did do was put approximately $130 million back in Kansas taxpayers' pockets, or correct me on the number.
Well, it's $130 million that is now deductible.
Yes.
And so that assumes that all of that is over the $10,000 cap. It's actually really difficult to say exactly what the federal tax, it would be less than $130 million because you have to apply that to the federal tax rates.
Percentage.
If all of that was over the cap and all of that was at the highest bracket at the federal level, it would be 37% of 130 million. And there's more of that that's going to show up in January of checks that were written the very last days of December and not received and processed by the state until the first week of January. So there will be more of that in January, and we'll keep you updated on that at the end of the month.
That's wonderful, because when I requested that bill, there was some pushback on it and said that we didn't need it in Kansas. But it was my understanding that this keeps taxpayer money in their pockets from federal money. And so it was a positive move. We need to look for more maneuvering like that between our state and federal taxes is what I'm trying to get at.
Any tax cut that we can enact that doesn't impact state receipts sounds like one that the state general fund wouldn't have to be concerned with at all.
Yeah, and most legislators shouldn't either. Yes, thank you, Eddie. Committee, I did have a question as to severance taxes. Which column do they show up in here?
They're in kind of that central section of other excise taxes. They're the two bottom lines on it, gas severance and oil severance.
Okay, I see.
If you look, you can see that fiscal '22 had a massive year-over-year increase in those taxes. That is because commodity prices across fiscal '21 were much, much higher than they were during fiscal '20. There's a 2-month lag on those taxes. And so when in 2020, fiscal 2020, fiscal '21 basically made up the time period associated with those that was the shutdown with the early part of the COVID pandemic. And so that's when oil prices and gas prices, of course, were very, very low. People weren't traveling. Fiscal '22 was kind of represents almost exactly the reopening with that time lag. And so you can see the 432% and 173% year-over-year growth rates in fiscal '22 on those. You can see further growth rates of 17 and 7% that we're currently projecting in '23, but then we do anticipate those commodity prices to kind of re-normalize for fiscal '24, and you can see accordingly the receipts go back down in that year.
Okay, great. Thank you, Eddie. Committee, any other questions for Eddie? I do have one other one, and you brought up the Apex bill. We have been told in the past that we can't get certain tax information because of privacy policy issues. What would it take in order for us to be able to see the actual tax credits, tax incentives, and how that works? Since that was a specific legislation, if a company, would we be able to put in legislation that would allow us to see the actual number for those results or lack thereof of results?
I'm going to want to follow up on exactly that question with you and not speak out of turn. It might be something that could be inserted into the actual Apex legislation itself that an agreement entered into under it would require the disclosure of certain incentives or something like that. But as you mentioned, generally speaking, with tax information, if there are 5 or fewer filers to which the tax provision applies, that information is required by, I believe, both state and federal law to be maintained as confidential to prevent the identification of taxpayers. There may be certain sort of incentive transparency provisions that could be enacted that might kind of be able to work around that. Almost contractually pursuant to those Apex agreements, but not generally. So I'll circle back around on that with you.
No, that would be great. And you might want to add to that too. I know this question has come up in the past when we're looking at tax policy as to who's getting incentives or not. And I've seen other states like New Mexico, if the building's built with taxpayer dollars, they actually have to put a sign on it to let people know. So maybe this is something the committee could look at in the future. It wouldn't be a high priority for this committee at this time, but I do think taxpayers have a right to know who's getting access to the money and what the results are. So committee, any other questions for Eddie? Seeing none, I would thank you very much for the work on this and the presentation, Eddie. Also, I know that you're going to be giving a couple of presentations next week on property tax Tuesday, Wednesday sales tax. Then we will pick up at a later date income tax. And I think we're going to allow time also for excise taxes. We're going to be taking a look at a few of those this year too. So we might as well get that in the queue. Thank you very much, Eddie. Committee, I would draw your attention to items in your packet. First off, being the rules of this committee, I would suggest that you peruse them and understand them. I will draw your attention specifically. We did change the language on one of them, that not only are we professional in the decorum with conferees, but also with our colleagues. We had a little bit of trouble last year, not with colleagues, but with one of our members with a conferee. We want to treat everybody with the utmost respect and make sure that they get the opportunity to present their case in a professional manner. So that I would draw your attention also, committee, to the rules that this is for the conferees. And we had a little bit of trouble. We were very lax, very forgiving, and it makes it difficult for John when we do not turn in the testimony within 24 hours. So please, and I understand there's a lot of people that are new to the process or may not understand, but please get your testimony in for hearing within 24 hours, so the day before the hearing. And, you know, if we do have extenuating circumstances, we understand that, but I would draw your attention to that, committee. Also, I don't think it's in your packet this time. We'll make sure and hand it out next time. We've got more information for you too. It is in your packet, the report on the special committee on taxation, the interim committee, and the results of that. Did you want to cover that? We've got about.
Yeah, I had been planning to cover both that and the blue sheet in front of you.
Okay, I didn't, okay, great. I'm sorry.
Sure, no, not a problem at all. The blue sheet in front of you is kind of in line with what I had previously been speaking of. It looks like this. It's got a table across the top. It does provide a bit more detail and some more historical information on kind of 6 categories that I have broken out there for you. The first of those are actually expenditure side categories. Typically speaking, this committee doesn't deal with those directly, but it is definitely important information for you to consider. The latter 3 of those are revenue side categories, and then the bottom one's kind of a comparison. So first, just as a highlight, the first column there, and all of this is data running from fiscal years 17 through 22. The first column is the all funds expenditure amount. That's something that usually is not thought of a lot, actually, at all, just because the general fund tends to get most of the attention. So that all fund expenditure amount includes, of course, the general fund expenditures. It also includes things like highway fund expenditures and also the various federal funds. And so there's a lot that goes into that it isn't even really necessarily tax revenue at all. And you can see that had been growing, anywhere in that 3 to 6% or 2.3 to 6% range, with the exception of 2020 was 14, almost 15% growth, and then 21 was about 12% growth over that. The second column is SGF expenditures. That has a bit more stability in its growth across most of this time period. You can actually see that there's a decline year over year in fiscal 2021. I believe the biggest driver of that is human service caseloads, the enhanced matching rate for a lot of those that has gone on through the pandemic kind of resulted in a year over year decline in expenditures. But then as that maybe pivots a little bit, it went away in. Well, that didn't actually go away in fiscal 22, so I don't know what all. I believe fiscal 22 included some one-time expenditures related to paying off some debt. SGF receipts, there's a lot less stability in this, as you can see. In fiscal 2018, that big 15% year-over-year growth, that was the 2017 tax bill showing up. And then in fiscal 20, you see the -6. You might recall that in the early stages of the pandemic, the individual income tax and corporate income tax filing and payment deadlines in April of that year were pushed into July. And so there was a big shift of money from fiscal 20 into 21, resulting in a year-over-year decline in 20, but then a big jump in 21, as you can see there, a 28% increase. The negative 11% amount in 22 was attributable to those one-time transfers that I talked about in the overview, the transfers out to the Budget Stabilization Fund and to CAPERS. And that's why if you look at the SGF tax-only receipts, there's not a -11 in 2022, there's a positive 9.5%. And so the SGF tax-only probably makes more sense with what you tend to think most about in this committee. A 21% increase in 18, that's the tax bill. A 5.7% decline year over year in 20, that's the shift in receipts. A 26.4% increase in 21, that is the other side of the shift in receipts, and also the big growth that we saw as the reopening started to happen. And then again, another year of big growth in 2022. The last column there, that all tax receipts amount, that includes the general fund, but also all of the other tax receipts the state receives. We don't oftentimes think closely about those. The two biggest categories of that are the tax receipts that go to the state highway fund, both the motor vehicle and the motor fuels and that fraction of the sales tax receipts, and then also the UI trust fund taxes that go there. Those are issues that tend to run through the Commerce Committee and not the Tax Committee, but that also makes up kind of the state taxes. And so the only other column that I want to highlight here is that table that is down below. This is an SGF receipts in excess of expenditures section. If this is a positive number, it means that the ending balance is growing, and if this is a negative number, it means the ending balance is shrinking. You can see 2020 was negative, but that, as I mentioned before, was attributable to those delays. 2020 was a positive to the tune of 1.6 billion, or excuse me, 21 was positive to the tune of $1.6 billion. That has about probably 500-ish million of the delay payment, but also that was the year when receipts really started coming in larger than we had anticipated. 2022 was negative, but as I mentioned earlier, there was some one-time spending in 2022 and also transfers to CAPERS and the Budget Stabilization Fund that make SGF receipts smaller than they normally would be. And so that's what I have on this page. If there are questions, I can try to field them, or I can move immediately on to the interim committee, if that's...
We're about out of time. Committee, if there's any questions, okay.
All right, do you want to move right along? All right, the interim committee was appointed by the LCC last summer. It was given 4 study tasks. The first of those was the effective implementation of the Constitution's requirement of statewide uniformity in property tax assessment. The second was the continued utility and necessity of Kansas's membership in the streamlined sales and use tax agreement. The third was the individual income taxation of Social Security and retirement income. And the fourth is kind of a broad just look at any inactive taxing jurisdictions or unused tax provisions that might be ripe for repeal. The committee met twice, once on November 18th and again on December 12th. At the November 18th meeting, the committee reviewed the 3 of the items, the Social Security and retirement taxation, the unused taxing provisions, and then also the uniformity of property valuation. At December 12th, the committee reviewed the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement. The executive director of Streamline came in for that and presented which was about 3.5 hour long presentation on that got very much into the weeds of sales and use taxes and the multi-state issues that arise with those. Following at the conclusion of the second meeting, the committee made recommendations. It had 3 recommendations on the Social Security and retirement related issues. There was general agreement to do something, but everyone has kind of their favorite flavor on exactly what to do, is maybe the way I would describe those recommendations, which is why there are 3 of them. The first of those is a recommendation to the legislature to eliminate the tax cliff and marriage penalty associated with the taxation of Social Security benefits. That's kind of as direct of a recommendation as an interim committee can get. The other 2 were that the legislature should consider eliminating that taxation generally, and explore the option of using a possible gradual elimination of that income, the taxation of that income, via the approach that was used in the conference committee report on House Bill 2597, which the Senate passed on the last day of session and was not taken up by the House, excuse me. On the second item, the property valuation, there was agreement by the committee that the legislature should evaluate and continue to discuss that process and the kind of controls that are in place on that process to ensure the uniformity. The intent of the committee on this was to give a very broad recommendation to make it clear that it wants the full legislature to study property tax issues in general and specifically the uniformity of them. Related to the streamlined agreement, the committee had 4 recommendations. One of those was that it continue to evaluate the impact of the streamlined sales and use tax agreement, both on the state of Kansas and its constituent governments, but also on Kansas taxpayers and Kansas businesses. The second was to specifically clarify exactly how Kansas's delegation to the Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement Governing Board conducts its voting. It's kind of been discovered that Kansas statutes are silent on that topic. The Streamlined Sales and Use Tax Agreement allows for up to 4 delegates per state, but it allows only 1 vote per state, and it allows the states to specify their own procedures on that. Kansas has never clarified its exact approach. The third was that the legislature should consider a $100,000 taxable sales requirement for in-state brick and mortar businesses that are subject to the sales tax, comparable to that same threshold requirement for the compensating use tax. And then the fourth was that the legislature should consider re-adding the compensating use tax line to the K-40 form that I had mentioned in response to Senator Reddy's question. On the last item, the unused taxing provisions and tax jurisdictions, the committee made a recommendation that the legislature should evaluate any expired provisions or unused taxing provisions and consider them for possible repeal. There were 2 kind of notes that the committee had on that. One of them is that does generate potentially some administrative issues in terms of forms and certificates that are out there in use by Kansans. That would they have to be renumbered as a part of that, and would that almost be more headache for Kansans than it's worth? And then the other thing is exactly how to identify what is truly an unused provision that is ripe for repeal versus an unused provision that is just unused because of its position in the business cycle. And so with that, I would stand for whatever questions the committee may have time for and have on this topic.
We're out of time. Committee, are there any quick questions? Seeing none. Thank you, Eddie, very much for the presentation, the information. You guys can always talk with Eddie offline. I appreciate it. Committee, I'm going to defer because of time. I'll make the bill request Tuesday next week. I hope that you all have a wonderful weekend and celebrate the holiday. Committee, any other business to be brought before us? Seeing none, we're adjourned. Thank you.